So in this video, I'm going to talk about osteology, the bones, and basic orthology of the wrist and the hand. But before I get into the bones, I want to talk about some basic terminology that's somewhat specific to the wrist and the hand. So when we talk about positions and directions in the body, we always start with the anatomical position. For the wrist and the hand, though, because they get moved around so much and because they're kind of a world unto themselves, there's some very specific terminology that's used there. So instead of anterior and posterior, you'll hear the terms palmar and dorsal used more frequently. And instead of medial or lateral, you'll hear the terms ulnar, so moving towards the ulna, which is over here, or radial, moving towards the radius. Okay, and then that keeps it specific when you move your hand around. So in terms of the bones of the wrist and the hand, what we think of the wrist is articulation between kind of the radius and the carpal bones. And the carpal bones, and there's 8 of them, are what make up the wrist. There's what we call the proximal row and the distal row. The proximal row includes the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetradum, the pisiform on top of the triquetradum, the trapezoid, the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. Then you have the metacarpals, and then you have the phalanges. So on your actual hand, okay, your carpal bones are here. Your metacarpals are kind of sort of what you might call the meat of your hand. And then the phalanges are your fingers. Okay? When we talk about a ray, that refers to the metacarpal and the associated phalange. So this would be the first ray, this would be the second ray, this would be the third ray, this would be the fourth ray, and this would be the fifth ray. And the metacarpals and the phalanges are named the same way. Note that in the 4 digits and the 4 fingers, there's 3 phalanges. There's a proximal, a middle, and a distal. For the first ray, for the thumb, there's just 2 phalanges. Okay, there's a proximal and a distal. Now in terms of joints of the hand and the wrist, of the wrist specifically, there's 2 joints. There's the radiocarpal joint, which is articulation between the radius and the proximal carpal bones, especially the lunate. There's the midcarpal joint, and that's the articulation of the lunate, or the proximal row, and the capitate. Then so the radiocarpal joint would be here, between the radius and primarily the lunate. Note that the ulna is not part of the wrist, okay, from a kinesiology perspective. So the wrist is the radiocarpal and the midcarpal joints. Going to the hand, there's what's called the carpal metacarpal joint, and that's the articulation between the carpal bone and then the metacarpal. So for the first ray, that would be the trapezium and the first metacarpal. For the second, that would be primarily the trapezoid, but also parts of the trapezium and parts of the capitate, and the second metacarpal. And then for the third MCP joint, or CMC joint, carpal, metacarpal, that would be capitate and the third metacarpal. For the fourth, that would be part of the capitate and part of the hamate with the fourth metacarpal. And then for the fifth, that's going to be the hamate, which is this carpal bone, and the fifth metacarpal. So there's 5 CMC joints. And then moving up from there's what are called the metacarpal phalangeal joints. So that's the articulation between the metacarpal and the proximal phalanges. All right, so there's 5 of those, 1 for each ray. And then there's the interphalangeal joints. So for the digits 2 through 5, there's a proximal and a distal interphalangeal joint. So the proximal is going to be the articulation between the proximal and the middle phalange, and the distal between the middle and the distal phalange, or the DIP, between the middle phalange and the distal phalange. Note for the thumb, because there's only 2 phalanges, there's only 1 IP joint. So on your hand, okay, so your radiocarpal joint and your midcarpal joint are here, all right. The carpal metacarpal joints are going to be kind of in here, right? The articulation between the distal carpal row and the metacarpals. The MCP joints, or metacarpal phalangeal joints, are going to be here, and that's kind of where your knuckles are. The articulation between the metacarpals and the proximal phalanges. And then your IP joints are basically within your fingers. So for digits 2 through 5, you're going to have a proximal and a distal interphalangeal joint. Okay, for each of these 4 digits. For the thumb, there's just one IP joint. And that's the osteology and basic orthology of the hand and the wrist.